Hey, friends, welcome back. Grateful to have you with us as we get into the Gospel of John here. Starting a new chapter today, chapter 15. Um, a pretty abrupt change of pace as yesterday Jesus has a discourse, and today moves a little bit more into, I don't want to call it lecture, but a monologue of sorts. And we get, remember that we have told you that 6 different times so far out of 7 total, Jesus has claimed something about himself with the words, I am. We jump right into number 7 with the first verse here. So read for a few and then come back and talk it through. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me, you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my word abides in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I've said these things to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be complete. So as we get to this 7th I am statement, I am the true vine, and this really becomes a sermon illustration of sorts for John as he talks about the vine and being attached, being rooted, being fruit bearers. And this is maybe one of the least obvious I am statements that Jesus uses, but it's one of the most communal. I think it's very important within the church, this idea that we are connected to Jesus and to one another. And in that connection, our calling is to stay connected to Jesus and to bear fruit. Michael, you and I don't know if we'd agree on this. I would say John has done his typical thing here, which he has maybe repeated himself more than he needed to, but he makes the point well, makes it often, that we are to stay connected, and that by ourselves, that's an interesting twist that we take here as well. By ourselves, we are incapable of bearing the fruit that we're called to bear in Christ.
I think that there is a rather popular mistake of sort of dividing the gospel between grace and action. And I think that texts like this in John, teachings like this from Jesus, resist that because ultimately what you have at the end of our conversation yesterday, when we looked at verse 31, you know, do as the Father has, I do as the Father has commanded me, so that the world may know that I love the Father. Then he gives this rise, let's be on our way. Then immediately we move into this text that is all about bearing fruit. And it is an image of action, right? Fruit is the result of life. And so when we're connected to the vine, then it's possible for the faith, which is a thing that begins in the inner work of the Spirit, but it through the life that comes through our connection to through something that is larger than ourselves, it will actually result in something. You can actually eat fruit. It can be turned into something that has earthly impact and value, right? And I think the earthiness of this illustration is a very important way for the church to recognize that, Clint, it's not just what we believe. And I think that with all of these red letters, and yes, with some meandering teaching in here, I think it'd be easy to think this is all intellectual, it's all theological, it's all philosophical. No, this is practical. It comes down to that when we're connected to the vine, then fruit will bear. If you abide in Jesus, then he's abiding in us. And if he's in us, then we can experience the kind of fruit making, life living, action faith action life, which can only come when we are doing that abiding work. And ultimately, we find ourselves in position then of asking, okay, so how then are we going to exhibit what that fruit is? What is the result of being in the vine? Jesus is going to answer that in explicit terms. But I think you have to remember that this is being delivered to a church. This letter is being delivered to the church that's navigating how it exists in the world as some of the first generation Christians are passing away. How can we be connected to the vine, who is Jesus Christ? How can we be part of this church when that church continues to morph and change to not just be in Jewish synagogues on Saturday, but now worshiping on Sunday in Christian places? Or, how does the faith move on in this kind of connected reality? And here, John's recording for us, Jesus has an answer for that. Jesus anticipated the day in which his abiding in the church would be of utmost importance, when knowing what the fruit of faith looks like would matter. And here John is relaying that text, not just for that church, but for our church, not just for those people, not just for those Christians, but for these Christians, for Christians today, for you and me. And I think that that's the amazing gift of a text like this, if you could hang on to it as it moves through.
I think one of the critiques of the American church has been that we sometimes define faith as what we believe, and we think about what makes us Christian as what we hold on to doctrinally, what we believe about Jesus. And certainly it matters what we believe, and it is vitally important what we believe. But I appreciate texts like this that give us a very simple calling as well to be fruitful. I mean,
Yep.
if you boil this down, Jesus is saying, stick with me and bear fruit, be fruitful. And I think because that emphasis we've put on doctrine and theology and arguing over Bible interpretation and doctrinal stuff, I think sometimes we've shuffled be fruitful further down the line than it needs to be. And I appreciate texts like this that put it back front and center, that stay the course and bear fruit. And we could, we could certainly try to parse out what that means, but Jesus' very clear instruction here is do the work of the Father, do the work of the Savior. Stick with me, be connected to me, and you will bear the fruits. Kindness, generosity. We could have lots of conversation about the specifics of that, but this call to action, I think, is important. I think sometimes it has been eclipsed by other things, and I very much appreciate Jesus' words here to kind of point us in a direction of having an active and engaged faith that is connected with Christ, connected with others, and that we could look at a person's life and say, oh, we see the fruit of discipleship. We see the outcome of following Jesus in their life. And hopefully that's the goal that we're all after.
But Clint, I think a thing that we need to connect here is exactly what you said previously, how relational of a text this is. And it's one thing to say that you need to practice loving a person from afar. It's one thing to say, try to think good thoughts about them or try to pray for them, even if they might be not your favorite person or they might even be your enemy. That itself is hard. But I think the implication here, and not just what it might lead us to, but the explicit demand here is that if you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. And love in this context, the kind of love that is bore out is the kind of love that only exists in relationship. So there is no shortcut path here. This isn't about just wishing well on others. No, this is about actual lived faith fruit in actual Christian community with lived people, with the hard people, with the people that you'd prefer not to have in that community. Christian love that is growing, that's bearing fruit, is leading to the creation of something real and tangible. And I think that Jesus's words here could easily be passed over as some kind of spiritual teaching, which they certainly are, but it's a spiritual teaching that is intended to lead to physical transformation and to life change. And if you want a frame for that, if you read First John, which is, I think, a letter to a Christian community with this theme at the center of it, I think you'll see that this is a costly kind of love. It's a demanding thing to be asked to grow into, because ultimately the abiding in the Father is going to lead Jesus to sacrifice of self. The kind of love that Jesus has for you and me led Jesus to give up everything so that we might have eternal relationship with He and the Father. The kind of love we're going to have for one another, the kind of abiding in the Father that Jesus invites us into, will inevitably cost us something too. And I think this text is an invitation to move, much like we saw the beginning of it, right? Jesus says in 31 of chapter 15, let us be on our way. Let's get moving. The moving of faith here, the action of faith, is being connected to the vine, abiding in the Father, and then letting those real life fruits of love grow in us, and then that be the thing that creates the reality of Christian community.
It's hard to know where to draw these lines in terms of the study, and I don't want to take anything away from the next time we're together, but if you look here at verse 12, which we haven't read yet, Jesus is above saying, keep my commandment, I keep God's commandment, you keep my commandment, then you abide in me. Well, we might wonder what the commandment is, and Jesus does us the favor here that you love one another as I have loved you. So that's going to ultimately be our North Star. That's going to be our compass heading. But before we move on to that, or to our next study tomorrow, I want to just back up, Michael, to verse 11, because I think it's significant that where Jesus points us to in this keeping of his commandments, in this life of staying connected, in this bearing of fruit, is ultimately joy. I've said these things to you that my joy might be in you and your joy may be complete. I think this is important because sometimes when we have a conversation about discipleship and about doing the work, it can sound like trudging up the mountain, right? We could say, oh, I got to go love people. Oh, I got to be giving. I got to be generous. I got to forgive that person who it is intended not to be easy, but it is intended also to be joyful. It is doing the work of Christ. It is bearing the fruit of Jesus that releases in us a holy kind of joy, a Christ-like joy. And to the end here, that our joy may be what? Complete. It may be full. It may be finished. It may be overflowing in us. And I think that can get lost. We can sometimes hear these through the filter of maybe guilt. Oh, I don't do enough, or I've got to do a better job. And of course we all do need to do a better job. But the idea here is not to just slog our way through life, hopefully bearing some fruit. It's to bear fruit and then embody the joy of Christ as we do it. And I think it matters a great deal that ultimately where Jesus takes us in this section is the idea of complete joy. I think that's a wonderful message. I think it's easy to forget, and I think we should definitely hold it close.
The gift that Jesus is giving us, and we're going to discover this, I think, in more explicit detail as we continue the study. I certainly hope that you'll subscribe to join us for that conversation. But I would say that the gift of finding joy here in the middle of this whole passage about love is unmistakable. This sticks out because so much of this is about remaining and abiding, which has with it this idea of both understanding the will of the Father, and then also this idea of being present to the Spirit's work in our life, right? So just being aware that God is within us, and sort of being wrapped up in that. And then the idea that leads us to these kind of explicit fruits that we're going to be growing, that discipleship is a moving part of our realities, okay? This inclusion of joy, I think, should be surprising, and it should stand out to us, because at the end of the day, the love that Jesus gives for us in the Gospel of John, Jesus is not tricked. Jesus is not overwhelmed. Jesus is not surprised by the cross. Jesus is talking about joy in full knowledge of crucifixion, in full knowledge of the pain and of the guilt he would bear, the forsakenness he would experience. Jesus, at this moment, knowing all of that, is speaking of joy. And so this command that we receive, which is to abide in love and then ultimately will be to love one another, it is a joyous command. It can work within us a spirit of jubilance, of thanksgiving. Now, that's not to say that it's always an easy a thing to live into, but that's the ultimate promise, is that when we bear the yoke of Christ, we're going to experience the joy of Christ, the kind of vitality of Christ living within us. It is a radically a radically different way of experiencing the world that God has given to us. It's not an endless series of tasks of us trying to be a little bit more moral as people who follow Jesus. It is an invitation to a new form of life which has Christ-like vitality, which leads us to love others, and as we love them, to discover the source of joy in our lives.
I think anybody who's spent some time around Christians and churches would say that we have room to grow in the area of joy. And,
Yeah.
Perhaps if there were more joyful believers, there would be fewer angry non-believers. And this is a good challenge for us. It's a good invitation to remember that the end product of bearing fruit, it is not just, slog it out obedience. There are moments in life where that's true, but that in being connected to the vine, in being connected to Christ, not only do we produce fruit, but that produces in us a complete joy. Your joy may be made complete. It's just such an important message for all of us as we try to be faithful and try to be faithful in the right ways as well.
I think the text we're going to read tomorrow is a pivotal text, and I think it's a well-remembered command from Jesus himself, which has far-reaching implications. So I hope you'll join us for that conversation. Certainly give this a like if it's helped you. It is helping many other people find these studies, and that's the quick and easiest way you can help that happen. Do subscribe so you can stick with us, get notifications when these studies happen. And that being said, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, everybody.